RCK. In continuation of the question I asked you last week, you made your point why the IRS should investigate the Church of Scientology to determine if it is still eligible to maintain its tax-exempt status. However, as you and other former Scientologists have made clear, the Church of Scientology terrorizes its opponents. What was also made clear on how the Church of Scientology got its tax-exempt status is that it countersued the IRS, bogged it down with paperwork, and went after the individual IRS employees involved in the case. People like you who publicly criticize Scientology know what you are getting yourselves into. Should the IRS investigate Scientology and the case lands on some poor, unsuspecting IRS agent's desk, what would you tell him or her on what to expect and how to handle Scientology's reaction? All right, great follow-up question here, RCK, because you bring up a good point, and it's a necessary one to consider. But let's be, again, realistic about this. No one individual IRS agent is going to be the person who's going to take on the Church of Scientology. It's going to be, committees of people, groups of people within the IRS, just as was done before. When David Miscavige first met with Jeffrey, I forget the guy's name, anyway, the IRS commissioner at the time, back in the early 90s, they set up a panel, a commission within the IRS to investigate Scientology's grievances and claims. And that was part of that 2-year process before they actually got their tax exemption. So I imagine something like that would happen again. However, so it's not going to be just one poor sod who's going to have to deal with the Church of Scientology. The case is far too lengthy. I mean, we're talking about decades of paperwork. We're talking about, reams of paper. So they're not going to dump it on some poor schlup who's just going to be terrorized by Scientology from that point forward. It would be a very, very different situation. Scientology's lawyers would be involved, their tax attorneys, and the IRS's attorneys would be involved. I mean, they're gonna come in real fast on something like that. And what Scientology would start to engage in right away would be endless amounts of appeals and anything else they could do to enter slows or stops into the process. That's the first thing they're going to try to do, because that's not overly antagonistic. It's just using all the loopholes and rules of the system against the people who are trying to, let's say, take away Scientology's tax-exempt status. Following that would be the whole dirty-handed activity of going after IRS officials and things like that. I'm wondering, given the past experience on this, whether Scientology would engage in the same tactics. Probably, because they simplistically believe that the cause of whatever previous success you've had is capable of causing it again. Sometimes that's true, sometimes that's not true. It depends entirely on the context. In this case, they probably could and would get away with doing countersuits or individual lawsuits or things like that. But here's the thing. The IRS is part of the government of the United States. So they really only have to put up with that kind of nonsense for so long. There is such a thing as vexatious litigation. There are lawsuits that people can bring against the government and do all the time, as you'll find out more about in a future podcast. I think coming up this next week, covering the topic of sovereign citizens. Those are another set of people who like to inundate the government with wads and wads of paperwork. Different from Scientology, but interesting in the similarities. Anyway, you'll see that podcast, like I said, probably this week. So the government would not, knowing how Scientology plays and knowing what they do and knowing how they operate, because so much more has been exposed to the broad public since 1993, when the IRS first capitulated. So now the IRS is in a much better place to get quickly educated or slowly educated, or however they want to go about doing it, on all aspects of Scientology. I mean, there's a ton of data out there now. There wasn't back then. So in some ways, the IRS they had this long, protracted battle, but every time Scientology was bringing something new or some new tactic, especially in the late 80s when they really got serious, the IRS didn't really see it coming. They didn't predict any of this. They didn't know what to expect. Now they do. So it would be a very different situation then and now. So those are a few of the things I can put there, because it's not a matter of me advising some poor, like I said, some poor schlep in the bowels of the IRS who's now going to deal with the Scientology problem. That's not how that would go down. Were there to be a single individual who I could talk to about this, I would be more than happy to debrief to them, as would many other people, to talk about how Scientology's tactics work and how to circumvent them, and how to bring things into a court of law so as to, bypass a lot of the nonsense and shenanigans that Scientology gets up to. Again, I think if you started looking into playing it, this is one strategy. I am no legal expert, okay, at all. But one thing I could think of to really go in hard on from the government position is watching for and dealing appropriately with any form of vexatious litigation that Scientology is trying to bring against the IRS or against its individual members. That, I think, could really be a tool they could use. But, like I said, I'm not a legal expert on that, so I might be wrong. They would not, I am sure, at this point, put up with individual Scientologists filing 1,200 individual lawsuits against individual IRS agents. They would combine all that stuff and turn it into some kind of class action thing and get it dismissed straight away. That kind of thing. I don't know that the IRS was really, this is conjectural on my part, but I don't know that the IRS commissioner really appreciated what he was up against, and I don't think he dealt with it appropriately at all. But I think they were really caught off guard, and I think that had a lot to do with all that pressure that was being put on the IRS and the public pressure. There were public PR campaigns being run in newspapers, and there was all kinds of stuff Scientology was doing. Knowing that all that is coming would put the IRS in a much better position than they were in last time to be able to head some of that stuff off at the pass. So anyway, I think I made that point pretty clearly, and I think that's how that all would go down. So I think, to be completely blunt with you here, I think your fears about the IRS and how Scientology would somehow, engage in some kind of brutal, unfair, fair gaming and warfare against the IRS, and the poor IRS is just not prepared for it, not ready for it. That's just not true. That's not how that should be looked at. The IRS's job is to grant tax exemption to religious organizations or charitable organizations as appropriate per the 501c3 points or the code points. And they should never have granted that to Scientology. And it has used and abused that tax exemption. So it is on the IRS to fix their mistake. I get the sympathy for the IRS folks, but then again, this is the IRS we're talking about. So this isn't like a bunch of great guys who, I feel a lot of sympathy and understanding for anyway. These are tax collectors we're talking about. And we're asking them to actually just do their job. So anyway, that's my feedback on that. Hope that answered your question. Feel free to fire anything else at me on this topic.